The mining colony on planet Kepler had been quiet for 3 months, and Jake Morrison liked it. That way because he could drink his coffee in peace and watch the stars without anyone bothering him about reports or duty, schedules, or any of the 100 other things that made military life annoying. And he was thinking about taking a nap when the alarm started screaming through the entire outpost, making everyone jump from their seats and run to their stations because something big was happening. And it was happening right now. Naomi Price was the first one to see it on her screen, and she called out that an unknown ship was coming toward them, and it was not like anything in their database, which meant it was either very old or very alien, or both, and either way, that was bad news for a small mining colony that only had basic weapons and a crew of maybe 200 people, who were mostly scientists and engineers, and not soldiers trained for combat against unknown threats from deep space. The ship that came out of the jump point looked like someone had taken a dream and a nightmare and mixed them together into something that should not exist in normal space because it had curves that seemed alive and crystals that glowed from inside, and it moved through the darkness like a giant fish swimming through water instead of the hard, mechanical way that human ships moved, and everyone who saw it felt something strange in their chest, like fear mixed with wonder mixed with the feeling you get when you see something so beautiful it hurts to look at. Captain Lisa Chang was in command, and she ordered everyone to battle stations but told them not to fire unless fired upon because first contact. Rules were very clear about not starting wars by accident, and even though her hands were shaking, she kept her voice steady and calm, which made everyone else feel a little bit calmer too. Because if the captain was not panicking, then maybe they would all survive this encounter. With whatever was inside that impossible ship, the view screen flickered and then showed them the alien woman and every single human in the command center. Stop breathing for a moment because she was unlike anything they had ever imagined, even in their wildest dreams about what aliens might look like, and she stood very tall, at least 7 feet, and her skin glowed with a soft light like moonlight on water, and her eyes were gold like melted metal, and her ears were pointed and swept back into silver hair that moved even though there was no wind, and she wore armor that looked like it had been grown instead of made, and covered with symbols that hurt to look at too. Long behind her they could see something even more impossible, and that was a dragon, and not a small one either, but a creature the size of a large horse, with scales that reflected colors that humans had no words for because their eyes were not made to see such things, and smoke came from its nose and its eyes watched the humans with an intelligence that was clearly equal to, or maybe greater than their own, and everyone realized at the same moment that they were not looking at a pet or a beast, but at another thinking being who had chosen to be their Jake. Morrison had never been good at keeping his mouth shut when he should, and before anyone could stop him. He said out loud that she was absolutely magnificent, and the moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to take them back. Because who says something like that during first contact with an alien species that could probably destroy their entire colony without breaking a sweat? But it was too late, and the words were out there floating in the space between humans and aliens like a bridge made of sound. The alien woman looked surprised, and her golden eyes got wider, and then something amazing happened because she smiled, and it was not a happy smile, but a sad one, like someone remembering something beautiful that was lost a long time ago. And when she spoke, her voice was perfect English, but it also had other sounds underneath it, like she was speaking in multiple languages at the same time, and the effect was both beautiful and deeply unsettling to everyone listening. She said that Jake was brave, and that his kind did not yet know what compliments would cost in the wars that were coming, and that single sentence changed everything, because it meant there were wars coming, and it meant she knew about them, and it meant that whatever had brought her to their small colony at the edge of human space was not a social visit, but something much more serious, and possibly much more. Captain Chang stepped forward and used her diplomatic training to introduce herself properly as Captain Lisa Chang of the Terran Colonial Fleet, and said that humans came in peace and were not looking for conflict with any species, and she kept her voice professional and calm, even though inside she was screaming with questions about what wars and what costs and what this alien woman wanted from them. The alien woman said her name was Kelleth, and she was from something called the Wandering Court, and she was the last Ranger of the Ashenvale Dominion, and those words meant Nothing to the humans, but they sounded important and old and sad, and she said she was not their enemy. It should have been comforting, but somehow was not, because if she was not their enemy, then what was, and why was she here warning them about? Wars, her dragon lifted its head and made a sound that was half growl and half song, and every human felt something primal and ancient in their bones, like genetic memory from when their ancestors lived in caves and feared the things that hunted. In the darkness, and the dragon was definitely one of those things that should be feared, even if it was not currently trying to kill. Eni and Akilith continued speaking and said that something called the Devourers had found human space, and that they had consumed her people, despite the fact that her people were millions of years old and had magic that could destroy stars and warriors who had trained for thousands of years. And if beings that powerful could not stop the Devourers, then what chance did humans have with their primitive weapons and short lives and limited understanding of the universe? She said the only hope was for humans to fight, but to fight in ways that would change what they were forever, and that sentence hung in the air like a threat or a promise or both, and nobody knew what to say, because how do you respond to someone who just told you that your entire species is about to be tested in ways you cannot imagine, and you will either change completely or die, and there is no third option? Jake found his voice again and asked what she meant by fight in new ways, and Keleth looked at him with those ancient golden eyes and said that humans would have to stop being civilized and start being something else entirely, because the Devourers expected civilized warfare and they could counter it easily, but chaos and madness and unpredictability were things they had never encountered before, because every species they had faced was old and wise and fought with honor and strategy. She said humans were young and reckless and had not yet learned the patterns that made other species predictable, and that this might be the only advantage they had against an enemy that had consumed countless worlds and billions of lives and turned entire civilizations into nothing but dust and memory. And the weight of what she was saying finally hit everyone in the command center, and they realized they were standing at a moment that would define human history forever. Amy Price asked how long they had before the Devourers arrived, and Keleth said that her ship had detected their scouts already in the outer system, and the main fleet would follow within months or maybe weeks, and time was running out faster than anyone wanted to believe, and they needed to start preparing immediately if they wanted any chance of survival. The dragon made another sound, and this time everyone could feel meaning in it, even though they did not speak dragon language, and the meaning was something like agreement mixed with challenge, mixed with a strange kind of respect for these small, short-lived creatures who did not know how doomed they were, but were still asking questions instead of running away in panic. Captain Chang made a decision that would change everything, and she said that Keleth should dock with the station and come aboard and share everything she knew about the Devourers and about how to fight them, and about what humans would need to do to survive. And Keleth agreed and said she would dock her ship within 3 hours, and that they should gather everyone who would need to hear what she had to say, because she would only explain once, and they would need to understand quickly. Jake watched as the alien ship began moving toward the docking port, and he felt something strange in his chest, and it was not fear exactly, but more like excitement, mixed with terror, mixed with the feeling that his life had just become much more interesting and much more dangerous, and he was not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it was definitely a thing, and there was no going back. Now the command center erupted into controlled chaos as everyone started preparing for the arrival of their unexpected guest and her dragon companion and Lisa. Chang began sending emergency messages to Earth Command and the Colonial Authority, and anyone else who needed to know that first contact had been made, and it was not with friendly neighbors, but with a refugee from a dead civilization bringing warnings of an approaching apocalypse. 3 hours later, Keleth walked onto the human station with her dragon, Vroth beside her, and the meeting that followed would become legend in the years to come, as the moment when humanity learned it was not alone in the universe, and also learned that being alone might have been safer. The connection between the two ships looked wrong, like reality itself was not sure how to handle metal touching crystal, touching something that was neither metal nor crystal, but alive in ways that machines should not be alive, and engineers watched nervously as the docking clamps engaged and held, despite all the readings saying they should not be able to hold because the two technologies were too different, but they held anyway. And that was the first impossible thing of many possible things that would happen. That Daclith came through the airlock walking like she owned the station. And maybe in some ways, she did, because she was older than human civilization and had seen things that humans could not imagine. And beside her walked Vareth the dragon, whose claws clicked on the metal floor and left small burn marks where they touched because his body temperature was higher than any normal creature should survive, and his eyes watched everything with an intelligence that made the security guards very nervous about their weapons, which suddenly seemed very small and useless. They gathered in the main briefing room, which was the largest space on the station, and people crowded in to see the alien woman and her dragon, and word had spread fast through the colony that first contact had been made, and everyone wanted to be part of history, even if that history might be their last chapter as a species. Because if what Keleth said was true, then humanity was about to face something that had destroyed beings far more powerful. Keleth stood at the front of the room and pulled out a device that looked like a living crystal, and it projected images into the air that were so clear and detailed. They seemed more real than reality, and she began to speak, and everyone listened because they knew their lives depended on understanding what she was about to tell them. She said that humans were young and that they measured time in thousands of years, but her people measured it in millions, and they were old when Earth was still a ball of hot rock cooling in space, and they had built cities that reached into orbit and forests that grew in perfect patterns, and they had dragons and magic and technology so advanced that the difference between them did not exist anymore. The images showed those cities, and they were beautiful beyond words, with towers of crystal and metal and living wood all woven together, and creatures that looked like elves and dragons living in harmony and creating art and science and philosophy. And they had millions of years to perfect their civilization, and they thought they were safe because what could threaten beings who had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe then? The images changed and showed something else, and it was hard to look at because it was like a stain spreading across space, turning everything it touched into wrongness and corruption in the humans. Watching felt sick just seeing the recordings, because even through the hologram they could feel that this thing was not natural and should not exist. Koleth called them the Devourers and said they came too Ashenvale 30 cycles ago, which was about 300 human years, and her people fought with everything they had, including magic that could unmake stars and dragons that breathed fire hot enough to burn through reality itself, and warriors who had trained for 10,000 years and learned every possible way to fight the battle. Recordings showed things that made no sense to human eyes, and physics and the Ashenvale were clearly powerful beyond anything humans could do, but the Devourers adapted to everything, and they consumed the warriors and learned how their weapons worked. And then those weapons stopped working, and they consumed the dragons and learned how they breathed fire, and then the fire could not hurt them anymore. Megan Brooks, who was the chief scientist, asked how many survived, and Keleth said 17. And the number hung in the air like a death sentence, because 17 survivors from 40 billion people across 200 worlds meant that the Ashenvale had not just lost the war, they had been almost completely destroyed, and these 17 were all that remained of millions of years of history and culture. Someone asked why she was warning humans if they were so primitive compared to the Ashenvale, and Keleth smiled that sad smile again and said it was because of Jake Morrison, and his first reaction to seeing something beyond his understanding was not to be afraid or hostile, but to see beauty and express wonder and kindness. And in her 10,000 years of life, she had learned that power meant nothing against the Devourers. But other things might matter, she said. Adaptability mattered, and creativity mattered, and the willingness to do unexpected things mattered, because the Devourers learned patterns and countered them. But if you had no patterns, then maybe you could survive long enough to hurt them in ways they did not expect. Keleth explained that her people had been too civilized and too predictable, and they fought with honor and strategy, and the Devourers learned those patterns in days and made them useless. But humans were young and had not yet learned to be civilized in the way ancient species were civilized, and that might be their only advantage. She said humans would need to fight like barbarians with nuclear weapons, and like mad scientists with no ethics, and like pirates with no honor, and every conventional warfare doctrine would need to be thrown away. Because conventional warfare was exactly what the Devourers were best at. Countering Jake spoke up again and said that Keleth kept talking about them fighting, but she was here helping, which made her part of the fight too, and Keleth looked at him for a long moment with those golden eyes that held the weight of ages, and she said, yes, she supposed it did make her part of the fight. And maybe that was why she had come to warn humans instead of just running farther into the darkness. The meeting went on for hours, and Keleth explained everything she knew about the Devourers and their tactics and their weaknesses, if they could. be said to have weaknesses, and the humans took notes and asked questions and tried not to think about how impossible this all seemed. She explained that the Devourers were not really individual beings, but more like a hive mind that could split itself into millions of pieces, and each piece could think independently, but they were all connected, and they shared information instantly, across light years, and that made them almost impossible to ambush or surprise, because what one learned they all learned, but there was hope, and the hope was that the connection between the pieces could be disrupted if you hit them in the right way with the right kind of energy at the right frequencies, and Keleth had spent 300 years running and studying them, and she had learned a few things that might help. She said there were places in space where reality was thin and the rules were flexible, and these places could be used as weapons or defenses. Relied on the laws of physics being consistent and predictable, and if you could make physics behave strangely, then their adaptation. Algorithms got confused. The most shocking part came when Keleth said she had convinced the other 16 survivors to come to human space and bring their dragons, and she proposed something that made the entire room go silent, and that was a bonding program, where humans would try to form partnerships with these ancient, powerful creatures. She said the bond was not slavery or control, but partnership, and Vareth was not her pet or weapon, but her brother, and together they were something that neither could be alone. And the bond let them share thoughts and feelings and power, and it made them far more effective in battle than either would be separately. Amy Price asked why the dragons would agree to bond with humans when humans were nothing compared to the Ashen Veil, and it was Vareth who answered, and his voice came into their minds, not through their binds, not through their ears, but directly into their thoughts, and it was ancient and amused. And he said they would bond with humans because humans might survive where the Ashen Veil could know, said he had lived 12,000 years and seen wonders beyond counting. But he had also watched his entire civilization burn and billions of his bonded brothers and sisters die. And he would rather die fighting with these strange, young, reckless creatures than spend his last years hiding in the dark places between stars waiting for the Devourers to find him. The room was silent after that, because everyone understood. They were being given a gift and a burden, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear, because these ancient beings were putting their trust and their remaining hope into a species that had barely figured out how to leave its own solar system. Keleth said time was short, and they needed to start training immediately, and she would teach them everything she could about fighting the Devourers, and about using the old ways alongside human technology, and about how to think in terms of energy and pattern. Instead of bullets and missiles, she said volunteers would be needed for the bonding program, and warned that it was dangerous and not everyone who tried would survive, because the bond required opening your mind completely to another consciousness, and some minds could not handle that and would break under the strange gag. Volunteered immediately without thinking, and about 70 other people did too, and Keleth looked at them with something like respect in her ancient eyes and said they were either very brave or very foolish, but probably both, and that was exactly the kind of attitude that might let humanity survive. Chang sent emergency messages to Earth and the Colonial Authority and every human world. 3 months had passed since Keleth arrived, and the mining colony looked completely different now, because the mountains had been carved out to make training facilities, and hundreds of ships orbited overhead, and thousands of soldiers had come from every human world to learn how to fight an enemy that should not be possible to fight. And in the center of it all was Keleth, teaching humans to see the universe in ways their brains were not designed to understand. Jake had been promoted to Major, even though he kept saying he was just a guy who liked aliens and did not know anything about commanding people, but the military did not care, because he had been the first to make contact, and Keleth seemed to respect him, and that made him valuable whether he wanted to be or not. The training was unlike anything in human history because Keleth did not teach them to shoot better or fly better or follow orders better, and instead she taught them to think differently about what weapons and tactics and strategy even meant in a universe where the normal rules could be bent or broken. She showed them holographic simulations of battles between the Ashenvale and the Devourers, and humans watched in horror as entire fleets were consumed in minutes, and every conventional tactic failed because the Devourers learned to fast and adapted too completely, and by the time you figured out what worked against them, they had already figured out how to make it not work anymore. Patricia Reeves was a colonel who had been put in charge of the training facility, and she watched a simulation where human ships fought the Devourers and lost badly, and asked how anyone was supposed to fight something that adapted that fast, and Keleth said, "You do not fight them the normal way." She said, "You make them fight you on your terms in places where their advantages become disadvantages. And you use weapons they cannot predict because they have never seen them before, and you accept casualties." That would make any normal commander surrender, because if you try to fight carefully and preserve your forces, then you will lose everything instead of just losing most things. Keleth taught them about spatial anchors, which were points in space, where the fabric of reality was thinner and could be manipulated, and she taught them about resonance weapons that did not destroy matter, but disrupted the connection between the Devourer pieces and their hive mind, and she taught them about sacrifice. Plays where you deliberately let the enemy kill you in order to kill them. Worse, the human commanders hated the sacrifice plays because their entire training had been about minimizing casualties and bringing everyone home, but Keleth made them understand that against the Devourers, there was no bringing everyone home, and the only question was whether your deaths would matter or be meaningless. But the most important and most controversial part of the training was the bonding program, and 17 Ashenvale survivors had come to human space with their dragons, and now they were trying to teach humans how to form the same kind of bond that had taken their own people thousands of years to master. Megan Brooks asked why they thought humans could bond with dragons when it had taken the Ashenvale so long to learn, and Keleth said it was because humans were different and their minds worked in chaotic patterns that might actually be better suited to the bond than the ordered, disciplined minds of her people. She explained that the bond required complete openness and trust and vulnerability, and the Ashenvale had spent millions of years learning to control their emotions and thoughts, but humans were messy and emotional and impulsive, and that mesensis might actually help them connect with the dragons in ways the Ashenvale never had. The bonding chamber was built in the deepest part of the mountain, and it was filled with crystals that amplified mental energy and made the connection between human and dragon possible, and 73 people had volunteered to try, and everyone knew that some of them would not survive. Jake was in the first group, and he walked into the chamber with his heart pounding because he had seen what happened to the people who failed, and their minds broke, and they had to be sedated and might never recover, and there was no way to know if you would succeed until you tried. The dragon that approached him was young by dragon standards, which meant only about 1,000 years old, and his scales were silver and black, and his eyes were like storm clouds, and his name was Ash. And when Jake looked into those eyes, he felt something pull at his mind like a hook catching in deep water. Keleth stood beside him and told him to open his mind completely and let Ash in and not fight against what he would feel. And Jake took a deep breath and did the hardest thing he had ever done, which was to stop being separate and let another consciousness merge with his own. The moment of contact was like being struck by lightning and drowned and set on fire all at once. And Jake felt ash flowing into his mind, and he felt ash memories of flying through nebulas and breathing fire that could burn stars. And he felt ash grief at watching the Ashenvale worlds burn and billions of bonded pairs dying and their deaths echoing through the bond. Network-like screams that never ended. Jake fell to his knees and tears poured down his face because the weight of Ash pain was too much for any human mind to hold, but he did not let go. He did not close himself off, and instead he sent back his own memories and his own feelings and showed Ash what it meant to be human and brief and desperate and full of hope, despite knowing how small and temporary you weren't. Something impossible happened, because instead of one consciousness dominating the other, they met in the middle and created something new, and Jake could feel energy flowing around him, and could see patterns in space that had always been invisible, and could understand concepts that human language had no words for but. He could also feel every death that Ash had experienced, and every loss and every moment of terror, and it hurt. So much he thought his heart would stop, but Kelleth was there. And she put her hand on his shoulder and said that this was the bond, and it meant carrying each other pain but also each other's strength. Ash lowered his large head and pressed it against Jake's chest, and Jake wrapped his arms around the dragon neck and felt warmth and power and love and brotherhood, and he knew that nothing would ever be it's the same because he was not just Jake anymore, but Jake and Ash together out of 73. Volunteers 16 succeeded in forming bonds, and the rest either failed safely or broke under the strain and had to be taken away to medical facilities, where they would hopefully recover but might not, and everyone understood the cost now, and it was high but necessary. The bonded pairs were different from normal soldiers and different from normal dragons.
Yeah.
2, because the humans changed. They're bonded dragons in unexpected ways, and the dragons changed their bonded humans, and together they became something that had never existed before. HL noticed this and told Jake that in 10,000 years of being bonded with Vareth, she had slowly become more like him. But Jake and Ash were becoming something new together, and that was unexpected. Because the Ashenvale bonds had always been about harmony and similarity, but human bonds were about chaos and synthesis. The training intensified after that. The bonded pairs learned to fly through space without ships and to channel energies that should have killed them, and to see threats before they appeared, and to coordinate with each other through their bond network in ways that no human military unit had ever achieved. Jake led a training exercise where 12 bonded pairs attacked a simulation of a devourer fleet, and they moved like a single organism, anticipating each other's actions and covering each other's weaknesses, and they destroyed targets that should have been impossible to destroy, but they also lost people because training accidents happened when you were learning to manipulate forces you did not fully understand, and 3 bonded pairs died during exercises, and everyone felt their deaths through the bond network, and it hurt, but it also taught them what death would feel like when the real battle came. More ships arrived every day, and more soldiers on Earth sent its best commanders and scientists, and every human world contributed what it could, because everyone understood now that this was not just about one colony or one planet, but about whether humanity would survive as a species. Scaleth taught the human commanders to think in terms of acceptable losses and worst-case scenarios, and she made them understand that every battle plan should assume they would lose at least half their forces, because anything better than that would be a miracle, and miracles should not be counted. Onami Price had bonded with a dragon named Storm, and she was learning to see energy patterns in space, and one day during training she discovered something important, which was that the Devourers adapted to patterns, but human psychology was too chaotic for them to fully understand. Showed this in a simulation where she made decisions based on random chance instead of military logic, and her survival rate went up dramatically because the Devourers could not predict what she would do next, and their adaptation algorithms got confused. Sedith said this was exactly the kind of thinking that might save humanity, because the Devourers expected rational strategic opponents, and humans were not always rational or strategic, and that unpredictability was a weapon if they learned to use it correctly. The months passed and the training continued, and scouts reported that the Devourers were getting closer, and the main fleet was maybe 6 months away, and everyone worked harder, because they knew time was. The Devourers arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong somehow, because the end of the world should not happen on such an ordinary day, but it did. And the warning came from sensors at the edge of the system saying that space itself was tearing open and bleeding darkness into normal reality like a wound in the fabric of the universe. The distortion spread fast, and from it came the enemy, and they looked different every time. You looked at them because sometimes they were ships made of geometry that hurt to see, and sometimes they were clouds of tiny machines, and sometimes they were just holes in space that consumed everything near. The Admiral Nathan Cross commanded the defense fleet from his battleship Defiance, and he had 200 human ships, which was every vessel Earth and the colonies could spare without, leaving their home worlds completely undefended, and it was not nearly enough, but it was all they had. Sullivan was his tactical officer, and she reported that the Devourers were not approaching like a normal military force, but more like a wave or a tide, washing over everything in its path, and there was no clear command structure or formation, just a spreading corruption that turned everything it touched into more of itself. Admiral Cross gave the order to execute the Wildfire Protocol, which was the battle plan Kelleth had helped them design, and it was based on one simple idea, which was that if you could not win by being stronger, then you had to win by being crazier. Every human ship had been modified with a combination of human technology and Ashenvale knowledge, and the result was vessels that broke the normal rules of space combat in ways that made engineers nervous, but also made them incredibly unpredictable. The frigate Phoenix folded space around itself, creating a gravity well that pulled Devour constructs into each other, and they collided and destroyed themselves because they had not expected anything like that, and the Destroyer Vengeance fired weapons that existed in multiple dimensions at once, cutting through enemy formations in ways that violated physics as humans understood it. Then the Dragon Riders launched from the carrier Aurora, and there were 16 bonded pairs, including Jake and Ash, and they wore armor that was half technology and half something else grown in bioforges that Khalith people had taught humans to build. Jake felt Ash's thoughts merge with his own as they dove into the battle, and terror and excitement mixed together until he could not tell which emotions belonged to him and which belonged to his partner, and together they were something more than either of them could be alone. A Keyleth voice came through their communication systems, and she was out there too with Varith, cutting through the darkness like a silver blade, and she reminded them that the Devourers expected strategy, but humans should give them chaos, and they expected fear, but humans should give them defiance. Battle became a nightmare of impossible shapes and broken physics, and human ships did things that should have torn them apart, but did not because they were using spatial anchors to bend the rules, and dragons breathed fire that burned in the vacuum of space because it was not normal fire, but something that existed across multiple dimensions. Humans fought with a fury that surprised even Kelleth, because they knew they were supposed to lose according to every logical analysis, but they did not care about logic, and they rammed their ships into enemy constructs when weapons ran out, and they used their jump drives as bombs, creating explosions in folded space that destroyed everything nearby, including sometimes themselves. Zemi Price commanded the cruiser Relentless, and she discovered something important during the fight, which was that when she made decisions based on random chance instead of military doctrine, her ship survived longer because the Devourers adapted to patterns, but pure randomness backed by skill was something they could not counter fast enough. She reported this to Admiral Cross, and he immediately ordered all ships to start incorporating random elements into their tactics, and suddenly human ships became much harder to predict, and the Devourers' adaptation rate slowed down because they could not figure out what humans would do next. Dragon Riders moved through the battle like nightmares made real, and they were small targets compared to ships, but they hit far above their weight because they could channel energies that normal weapons could not, and they could see patterns in the enemy formation that computers missed. They were bonded together through their network, so they moved like a single organism with 16 bodies. Jake and Ash dove through a formation of Devourer constructs breathing fire that existed in multiple spectrums, and their flames did not just burn matter, but disrupted the connection between the constructs. In the hive mind and everywhere they struck, the enemy formation became confused and started attacking itself. The battle was brutal, and ships died and people died, and Jake felt it when the first bonded pair was killed because their deaths echoed through the bond network, and everyone felt it like a physical blow, and then another pair died, and another, and the pain of their deaths was almost too much to bear. Holly Chong commanded a dragon named Ember, and she was Amy's younger sister. and she led a strike team deep into the enemy formation, trying to reach a coordination node that Keleth had identified as important. They were succeeding when a Devourer construct adapted faster than expected and caught them. Jake felt Holly death through the bond, and he screamed because it was not just her death but Ember death too, and the loss of both bonded partners at once was like having part of his soul ripped away, and he wanted to stop fighting and curl up and cry. But Ash would not let him because the battle was not over. The fighting went on for 18 hours, and it was the longest day of Jake's life and probably the longest day in human history, and ships kept dying and people kept dying, but the humans did not break. And they did not run, and they fought with everything they had. Keleth had taught them well, because every time the adders adapted to one tactic, the humans switched to something completely different. And they used weapons the enemy had never seen. And they made decisions that made no logical sense but worked anyway, because sometimes chaos beats order. The turning point came when Amy discovered that the Devourer's central coordination was vulnerable to disruption if you hit it with the right frequency, and she called this information to all ships, and every vessel that had resonance weapons started targeting the coordination nodes. The effect rippled through the enemy fleet, and suddenly the Devourer constructs started having trouble communicating with each other, and their perfect coordination broke down, and they began making mistakes and attacking each other and wasting energy on targets that did not matter. Admiral Cross saw the opportunity and ordered every ship to focus fire on the largest concentration of enemy forces, and the human fleet poured everything they had into that single point. And the Devourers tried to adapt, but they were too disrupted and too confused, and for the first time in recorded history, they started to retreat. The retreat was not orderly, because the Devourers did not retreat normally, but it was definitely a retreat, and the enemy constructs pulled back toward the edge of the system and disappeared through the same tier in space they had come from, and then the tier sealed itself, and they were gone. The human fleet was devastated, and out of 200 ships, only 80 survived, and thousands of people were dead, including 3 dragon riders and their bonded partners, and every ship that remained was damaged and low on ammunition and barely holding together. But they had won, and that was something no other species had done in the recorded history of the galaxy, and the Devourers had been stopped and driven back, and humanity had survived its first real test. Jake sat in Ash's saddle in the wreckage of the battle and looked at the debris field that stretched across millions of kilometers, and each piece of debris represented someone who had died fighting, and he felt the weight of all those deaths pressing down on him. Keleth found him there, floating in space with Vareth beside her. And she said his people had died well as warriors and not as victims, and the Ashen Veil would have been honored to fight beside them. Jake asked if this had been the main fleet, and Keleth said no, this was just a scouting force, and the main fleet would be much larger and much more dangerous, and they had maybe months or maybe a year before it arrived. But something had changed, because the Devourers had expected an easy victory, and instead they had been hurt and confused and driven back, and that had never happened before. And maybe that meant something, and maybe it meant humanity had a chance. The year after the first battle became known as the Forge Year, because humanity was being hammered and shaped into something new. And it was painful and difficult, but necessary if they wanted to survive what was coming, and everyone knew that the main Devourer fleet would not be stopped as easily as the scouts had been under Keleth's guidance, and with help from the 17. Ashenvale survivors, humanity built a new kind of civilization, where the line between technology and what Keleth called the old ways disappeared completely, and human scientists worked side by side with Ashenvale mystics, creating weapons and defenses that were neither purely one thing nor purely another, but something that had never existed before the dragon. Bonded became the core of a new military branch called the Storm Wardens, and their numbers grew slowly because the bonding process was still dangerous and killed about 1 person in 5 who tried it. But by the time the main Devourer fleet arrived, humanity had 43 bonded peers. Jake was now a colonel. Even though he still insisted he was not command material, but nobody cared what he thought because he was one of the best bonded riders, and Ash had grown significantly larger, and his Scales now carried patterns that seemed to shift and change, reflecting both dragon nature and something distinctly homunculus. Noticed this one day while watching. Jake and Ash practice aerial maneuvers, and she commented that Jake had changed. Ash in ways that should not be possible, because in 10,000 years of being bonded with Vareth, she had slowly become more like him, but Jake and Ash were becoming something entirely new together. It was true because the human-dragon bonds were different from the Ashenvale dragon bonds, and where Kelith people had spent millennia in harmony. With their partners, humans and dragons crashed together, creating something chaotic and unpredictable and powerful in ways that surprised everyone. Main Devourer fleet arrived on a Tuesday, which was either cosmic coincidence or proof that the universe had a dark sense of humor in this time. Humanity was ready because the defense was not centered on one colony but spread across 3-star systems with spatial anchors and fortified worlds, and most importantly, Allies' word of humanity's first victory had spread through the few remaining free civilizations in the galaxy, and some had come to help because they saw in humanity something they thought was lost, which was hope, and small fleets arrived from a dozen species and survivors. Like Kelith, people who had been hiding found new courage. The battle that followed lasted 3 weeks, and it was not a single fight but hundreds of engagements across multiple star systems, and it redefined what warfare meant on a galactic scale because both sides were learning and adapting and evolving their tactics in real time. Admiral Cross commanded from the new flagship Wildfire, and he coordinated a defense that looked more like organized chaos than military strategy. Because ships appeared and disappeared through jump points with no obvious pattern and dragon riders struck from impossible angles, and entire fleets would retreat, suddenly drawing the enemy into kill zones. The Devourers brought enough force to crack planets, and they brought adaptation algorithms that had consumed countless civilizations, and they brought the absolute confidence of an enemy that had never truly been stopped, but humanity brought something they had never encountered before, which was creativity born from desperation. Human tactics changed constantly and sometimes from moment to moment because commanders were encouraged to make decisions based on intuition and random chance as much as on logic, and this made human forces almost impossible to predict because they did not follow any consistent patterns. Jake led a squadron of 12 dragon riders on a mission that was simple in concept and suicidal in execution, which was to penetrate deep into the Devourer fleet and destroy the central coordination nodes that connected the swarm. And if they succeeded, the enemy would be crippled, and if they failed, they would die, and there was no middle ground. Holly, younger brother Danny, had bonded with a dragon named Spark, and he flew beside Jake commented over the communication system that this plan was insane, and Jake agreed but pointed out that insanity was their best weapon. Because the Devourers expected rational opponents, the Dragon Riders dove into the heart of the enemy fleet, moving through space like living missiles and weaving between Devourer constructs and burning paths through the corruption with fire that existed across multiple dimensions, and they lost 4 riders in the first few minutes and felt their deaths like physical wounds through the bond network, but they reached the core, and what they found there was an impossibility, which was a structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that humans had no names for. And it pulsed with dark energy and coordinated the movements of millions of Devourer entities across light years. Jake called Kelith on the quantum communication system and said they had found it, but were not sure they could destroy something that existed in multiple dimensions at once. And Kelith responded after a pause that felt like forever. She said they could not destroy it alone, but together with every bonded pair and every Ashenvale survivor channeling through their bond network, they might accomplish what had never been done before, which was to burn the Devourers from inside their own pattern. What happened next would be studied and argued about for generations because it was something that existed at the intersection of science and magic and consciousness, and every bonded pair opened their connections simultaneously and channeled not just power, but intention, which was the unified will to survive and protect and defy the energy that flowed through Jake. And Ash felt like being unmade and remade every second, and he could feel Kelith ancient will steady as a mountain, and he could feel the terror and the determination of his fellow humans, and he could feel Ash's love for him fierce and unconditional and burning like a star end. He could feel the moment when the Devourer's coordination node shattered because it was designed to handle data and algorithms, but not the focused will of hundreds of conscious beings all pushing in the same direction with the same desperate hope. Effect rippled through the enemy fleet instantly, and without central coordination, the Devourer constructs began making catastrophic errors, and their adaptation algorithms created feedback loops, and they started attacking each other and consuming their own forces, and the tide of corruption faltered, then broke and ran and disappeared back through tears in space, leaving behind wreckage and silence. The cost was terrible because 2/3 of the human fleet was destroyed, and 17 Dragon Riders died, including Danny and Spark, and millions of civilians had been killed in attacks on border colonies, and every surviving ship was damaged and barely functional, but humanity survived. And more than that, they had proven something that no other species in recorded history had managed, which was that the Devourers could be stopped and beaten and driven. Awajik found Keleth in an observation deck overlooking Earth, and the planet glowed blue and green below them, beautiful and fragile and still there, and Vareth was coiled beside her, and Ash rested nearby, and the four of them watched the world. Turn in Silence. Galeth spoke first and asked if Jake remembered his compliment from that first day, and he said he remembered, calling her magnificent, and she smiled and said that no one had called her that in 3,000 years because her people saw her as a warrior and a leader, but not as someone beautiful. She said humans were magnificent too, because they were brave enough to be kind to monsters and brave enough to bond with creatures that terrified them and brave enough to fight wars they should lose, and she had been more right than she knew when she called Jake brave. Jake said the Devourers were not destroyed, just driven back, and they would return, and Keleth agreed and said they had maybe months or maybe years, but the enemy would come again stronger and more adapted. But something fundamental had changed because the Devourers had learned that some species did not go quietly into the darkness, and they had learned that chaos backed by courage could burn even them, and they had learned that humanity was not prey to be consumed, but a threat to be feared. Vareth spoke then, and his ancient voice filled their minds, saying that the war was far from over, and the Devourers would adapt and return. But Jake answered that humanity would be ready, because they would keep fighting and keep adapting and keep being unpredictable until either the Devourers were destroyed or humanity was scaled. Placed her hand over Jake and said she wanted to offer another compliment, which was that humans were not just brave, but were becoming what her people once were, which was guardians of the light, and perhaps together they could become what neither species could be alone, which was victorious. Below them, Earth turned, and above them the stars shone, and somewhere in the deep darkness between galaxies, the Devourers regrouped and planned and adapted, because that was what they did. But for the first time in their long existence, they had encountered prey that fought back with hope and madness and love, and those were weapons. They had never learned to counter the alliance between humans and Ashenvale and dragons, and the other surviving species grew stronger, and they built new defenses and trained new warriors and developed new weapons, because everyone knew the Devourers would return. But humanity had earned its place among the stars through blood and sacrifice and impossible courage, and